I'm Dave Thomas, and today I am building the BT-55 Pulse by Mach1 Rocketry. This is a fiberglass rocket, and if you're new to fiberglass rockets, this is a good one to start with. But if you're new to rocketry, this is not a good one to start with for a couple of reasons. One is that everything is going to be put together with epoxy, and that requires a little more skill and experience. And also, these kits don't come with any instructions. So they assume that you know how to build rockets fairly well already. Other things that are unique to Mach1 is that they have different levels of add-ons that you can buy with your kit. So you can get the basic kit, which does not include the decals. I went ahead and ordered the decals with it. It also does not come with any type of parachute. It does come with Kevlar shock cord, but that's about it. These are very basic kits. So if you want, if you don't have a parachute to go with this, then you may want to go ahead and get one, either the one that they have or some other one. Regardless, let's find out what we have in here. Now, the other thing about fiberglass kits is that fiberglass has little glass fibers in it, and especially any place that's been cut or roughened or ground or sanded, anything that disturbs the finish tends to loosen those fibers, and they can end up in your hands and in your eyes and such. And so once we get going here, you'll see me wearing gloves a lot so that I don't get fiberglass in my fingers. Alright, so inside this is our main body tube. Okay, and often Mach1 will have the same kit in different sizes. That's why they actually specify this kit name is the BT-55 Pulse. Alright, so there's our main body tube. It is pre-slotted. Now a lot of times we'll have to go in with a little file or some sandpaper and clean that up a little bit, and that's one of those instances where you want to definitely have gloves and probably safety glasses and a face mask. All right. Down here, this should be our motor mount. There we go, 24mm motor mount tube, also in fiberglass. Now the nose is just a plastic nose, and on a lot of the Mach1 kits you can upgrade this to fiberglass as well. Alright, we have 3 fins here with fin tabs, so those will go into the slots. Alright, now this does not come with a launch lug. Instead it comes with micro rail or mini rail buttons. I don't use this size a lot, and with the size it is, you could easily just put standard 1010 rail buttons on there, or you could put probably a 3/16 or definitely a 1/4 inch launch lug on this if that's the way you want to go. So that will depend on your own launch system or the people you launch with. Okay, and then finally in here we've got a standard sized engine clip. Alright, now this means that you will only be able to use the Estes C and D type 24mm motors and the equivalent size in any composite motors. Now what I am going to do, I think, is instead of putting this in, I may put in a screw-on motor retainer there, and then it won't have an engine block, so it's actually using the clip as an engine block there as well. And instead, if you're using black powder motors, you have to make your own external engine block there out of masking tape, which Estes does for a lot of their rockets already. Or if you're using a composite motor, it has a built-in retaining ring on the outside. Okay, and we've got 2 centering rings. One of these is notched for the shock cord as well as possibly for the engine clip there. Alright, and then we've got our Kevlar shock cord here, and I want to check something. This looks awfully short. The rule of thumb is at least 3 times the length of your rocket. So as I'm measuring this across, alright, it's 3 times the length of my body tube. So I may decide to put a little bit longer cord on here. We'll see what happens when we get to that point. Because, you know, a third of that length is just getting it out of the rocket. Okay, but it looks like we have everything here. Now something else we'll want to do, because this is fiberglass, it often has a thin layer of oil on it from the molds and mandrels that they use for putting these down. I use a solution here of 40% ethanol, and this, let's see, I think is it's about half a liter here, or a pint. And to that you add just a drop of dishwashing liquid, and I just spray this on and use a paper towel to wipe it off. Some people like to, if you got a big sink or a bathtub, they like to just fill that with soapy water, immerse all the fiberglass parts in that, and wipe them down. That works too. It's a little bit messier. And you do want to be careful not to leave the fiberglass in for a long time. Like, don't do it overnight. This fiberglass will absorb some water, and it makes it looser. Okay, well, it looks like we have everything we need to build here. So I'm going to go take my fiberglass and wash it, and then we'll come back and start building. I have all of my fiberglass washed, and now it's time to work on the motor mount. Now I'm going to at least go through the motions of how you'll put this on if you want to use the enclosed clip type motor mount. The first part's going to be the same though. So I'm going to mark one end of this as aft on the inside there, so I know that's facing the rear of the rocket. And we need to make a mark 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters from the aft end on our motor mount tube here. Okay, so that's 2.5. I'm going to make a mark right here. And that's where the inside edge of my aft centering ring is going to go. Okay, so this will be the aft centering ring. And so that's going to slide up here, and we don't want it to go past that mark. Because when we install this, it needs to go right at the base of my fin slot here. Okay. Now, if you're going to use the clip, right here, then we need to make a mark at 6.5 centimeters from the aft edge, the aft end here. So that's going to be right about there. Okay, and you'll need to use a file and cut away a little bit there, enough so that this part can slip in there. Alright, and then you'll have some overhang down here. Alright, and then on your aft centering ring, the one with no notches, you're going to have to use a file and make a notch on the inside here, enough so that your clip, mine's actually going to fit without it. So if you can't get that aft centering ring on there like that, then you will have to put a little notch in there. Okay, mine's actually got enough play in it that that'll work okay. Alright, so notch or a slot there, and then if needed, a hole or a notch in that aft centering ring, and you should have about that much overhang. Now if you want, you can back this off a little bit. Okay, so instead of putting your mark at 6.5 centimeters, put it at 6, alright, which is going to put it down to about there. And that'll give you more room and a little more flexibility there to get your engine in and out. And that's kind of a matter of personal preference. Either way will work. Now that I've said that, another upgrade you can make here if you don't want to put on a screw-on retainer is that you can get what Estes calls their E-motor retainer, and it's just a longer clip. Alright, so here's one of their E-motor retainers, and you'll just have to make your notch up here, or that little filed down hole, a little bit higher. Okay. Now the reason I want to just go with the upgrade is that there's no internal thrust ring in here. It's relying on this little bit of metal, and after a few flights this tends to get corroded. Okay, so you might end up with a motor going up through there that you didn't expect. Now with the screw-on retainer here, you're going to put your centering ring there in the same spot. All right, and this is just going to go on the end and then screw on like this. Now this is basically for composite motors. So composite motors all have an aft thrust ring that hooks in here. If you're going to use a black powder motor, you need to use some masking tape to basically make a thrust ring on that motor and then put it in. And as weird as it sounds, it does work. Okay, so that's what you'll need to do the clips. As I said, I'm going to use a screw-on retainer here because they're not very expensive and they're a nice upgrade. I've laid down some paper towels here in preparation for using some epoxy. Now the forward thrust ring is the one that already has 2 notches built into it, and that's going to go on here. Okay, it doesn't really matter where it goes as long as it's at least 9 centimeters from the aft end, because that way it clears the fin slots. I like to put it fairly well out here because this also is the anchor for the shock cord, and the less wasted shock cord length we have down here, the better. Now it's only like 8 centimeters or so, but it's just the principle of the thing. Alright, now this came with a little bit of masking tape over the ends, and as you can see here, it's already starting to fray, and that's very common with Kevlar, as it's a very slippery type of fiber. So what I'm going to do is just take some regular super glue here and just put a dot on each end, and I want to make sure it gets down past the frayed area there. Alright, and then we'll just take a tissue or paper towel or something here. Alright, and wipe those off. And they'll dry pretty quickly in this state. If you want to, you can hit them with some accelerator, which is just alcohol. You can get your own accelerator a whole lot cheaper than buying it. Just get some alcohol and a sprayer. Alright, so now those are hardened, and now I'll just take my hobby knife here and cut off the frayed ends. Alright, and that's just going to make it a whole lot easier to work with. Okay, so now I'm going to take that off for just a minute. On the forward end of our engine mount, I'm going to tie this on. And you can use just a simple overhand knot like that. There we go. Alright, and tie that down. Now, if you like, you can sand the area where your centering rings are going to be. Okay, so here I'm going to use some 100 grit sandpaper. My centering ring is going to go right about there. So I'm just going to roughen that up a little bit. And this will just make a better bonding surface for the epoxy. Definitely have gloves and safety glasses and a mask on for this, because you don't want to inhale the fiberglass. I'm going to do the same thing down here, and actually I'm going to do everything from about here down, because my fins are going to go, they're going to stick on at about there, at about 9 centimeters from the aft end. So I won't know exactly where until I get it in, so I'm just going to roughen up that whole area. And that'll also give me a rough surface back here for the aft centering ring and for my motor retainer. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the other end of my shock cord through the centering ring. Okay, Okay, and that's going to go on here. I'm just going to dry fit it for a moment. Now, what's going to happen here is I'm going to push this whole thing up. I'm going to put a ring of epoxy around this and then push both the shock cord and the ring into that. And if I need to, I'll put some more epoxy on the forward edge. And then I'll do the same thing with the aft ring. I'm going to just dry fit this on. I'm going to put a ring of epoxy in here and just push that forward. Okay. So I'm going to use 5-minute epoxy for this. If you're not accustomed to using epoxy, I would suggest using a 15-minute epoxy. It gives you some more working time. All right. And with any epoxy, just mix equal halves of the resin and the hardener, and you can do that with this amount that we're using either by weight or by volume. I tend to do it by weight. All right, and just mix that up for a minute and we'll have it ready to go here. So I'm going to go off camera, mix it up, and then come back. Here I have my epoxy mixed up, and so I'm going to start up here with the shock cord. I'm just going to kind of blorp that around there. That is the scientific term for this method, blorping. All right, and go ahead and get it on the shock cord, over that knot and everything. Okay, you can get some up here for the ring. Now I also have some alcohol standing by here because you can use that to remove uncured epoxy. Alright, so now I'm just going to put this down. Alright. And here, it takes a little bit of dexterity to do this all at once. Alright, but I'm just going to tighten that and then slide the ring down. Now once I get the other ring on, we'll kind of fine tune that there. Alright, for my other ring, I need some epoxy down here. Now if you're using the clip type of motor retainer, don't get epoxy on the lower part of the clip that is going to be aft of the centering ring, because you want that to be able to move freely. Alright, so here I'm just going to put this on, and as it hits the epoxy, I'm just going to turn it. Okay, I'm actually going to back that off just a little bit, just in case the epoxy gets up into where the fin slots are. It's not a big deal if it does. We'll just modify the fins a little bit. Okay, so this one. Okay, so here I need to do a little modification. I'll put some alcohol on my fingers. I'm just going to use that to smooth this in and around. Okay, and we want that shock cord to kind of be laying down there. Now if it ends up sticking up when we're done, we'll just trim it off. Okay, try and keep that perpendicular to the tube. Same down here. Alright, and now I'm going to take another tissue, put some alcohol on that, and we'll wipe off the stuff that got down here so that we don't have blobs of epoxy that could interfere with the fins. So just do a quick cleanup here. Alright, and then we are going to let that cure for at least 15 minutes. The motor mount is still curing, and while I do that, I'm going to start work on the nose cone. Now you may be asking yourself why I didn't put the motor retainer on here yet since I had the epoxy, and the reason for that is I prefer to do that as one of the last steps so that it's not in the way while I'm trying to put the motor mount into the tube itself. Alright, I just noticed that moved down a little bit more than I wanted. Okay. So for the nose cone here, It's made in two halves and it has a seam here opposite each other. And depending on how fastidious you are and how smooth you want your nose cone, you can do several things here. You can ignore it completely, all right, or you can do some sanding here, and if necessary, you can fill in any low spots. So I'm going to at least sand this and see how it goes. I'm starting with 220 grit sandpaper, and first I'm going to sand the two seams here so that they get knocked down. And then once I've got that, I'll sand the entire surface to give a better gripping surface for the paint. Okay, so I've kind of uniformly roughened up the finish here. And if we look at the seams now, most of them are gone. There are some low spots here that are still visible, not so much on this side. And so I'm going to go ahead and take this over to my sink now and wet sand it. Also first using some 220, but then moving to 320 and 400 to give a nice smooth finish here. You could dry sand it, but it tends to clog up the sandpaper a lot more. So if you're not familiar with wet sanding, what I generally do is just go to a sink, have a trickle of water going, and using wet dry sandpaper, just moisten that sandpaper, moisten the nose cone, sand it for a bit, rinse both, and repeat until you get the finish that you like. So I will go off camera and come back when I'm finished. Here's how my nose cone looks after wet sanding here. I started with 220 grit, worked up to 320, 400, and then 600. Now it's still, it doesn't have the glossy finish that it had when it was molded, but this is very smooth, and after priming and painting will look really good. There are two little low spots, one right there and one right there, and these will likely be filled in by the primer and paint as well. So I'm happy with the way this has come out, and I'll actually take it over to start the priming and painting process. The epoxy on my motor mount has cured, and so before we put this in, I do want to shave off this little bit here, and I'll just do that with my hobby knife. Since it's been saturated with epoxy, it just kind of whittles off here. Alright, and now before we put this in, I'm going to take the shock cord and slide it down inside and out the other end. And this will just keep it out of the way for when we glue this thing in. Alright, so I'm going to do a dry fit here. And my aft centering ring has a little bit of epoxy on it there. We'll just shave that off as well. There we go. Try this again. Now our aft centering ring should go to just below the fin slot there. So I can just see it there. I can back that off. Okay. Now if you put on one of the spring type engine clips, that should be sticking out about there or a little bit farther. If you're using a screw-on type here, we'll do a quick test fit before we glue stuff together. So I'm just going to slide this through. Alright, and that should go on just like that. So basically the very edge of this lines up with the very edge of the body tube, and that'll give us lots of room there for the screw on. Now, I don't remember if I mentioned this before, I don't think so. The BT-55 size of this is the same diameter as the screw-on retainer if you don't include the knurled area here. So the knurls stick out beyond the body tube just a little bit. Something to be aware of. So it will have a little tiny bit more drag there than if you put on the engine clip. Alright, that's everything there looks like it's supposed to be. Okay, now I do have a little bit of epoxy here that kind of formed its own fillet, and there's a blob here that I just cut off. So you may want to rotate this around if you do have a gravity blob like that, so that it's not lining up with a fin hole. Okay. It may be that there's enough epoxy on here that it bumps the fin out just a little bit, and if that's the case, all you need to do is take the fin here, and you might have to file down just a little bit on this tab. Okay, and I'm going to do a quick fit here, and actually I'm not going to have to do anything, it's just fine. Okay, so the next thing we'll do here is we're going to take some epoxy on a stick and put a ring of epoxy just beyond the fin slots, so that we'll push the centering ring through that. Okay, and then we'll also put a ring back in here before we push this all the way in, and then the aft centering ring will push through that one. Okay, so that each ring will have its own ring of epoxy there. One more thing I'm going to do before I start mixing epoxy is I'm going to take this to a door frame and just make a line in between two of the fin slots there, and that's where the launch lug or the rail buttons will go, whichever one you decide to use. I've mixed up about 5 grams of epoxy. Now I'm using 5-minute epoxy again. You can use longer cure times if you want, if you like the longer working time, but this is usually good for me. 5 grams is probably more than I'll need, but I don't want to run short and have to make up a new batch to get the aft centering ring on. Okay, so here I'm using a cotton applicator, and I'm just running that up until I get to where I want my ring of epoxy. Okay, and we can be fairly generous here. We just don't want it so big that it's making blobs as we're trying to put it on. But we do want it to make a nice self-making fillet as we push the ring through it. Okay. So now I'm going to slide this in about halfway, actually not even halfway. Alright, so I can give myself room here. Now here we want to try not to have the epoxy get on the motor mount tube, because if it's in the wrong place, it will interfere with the fins. And that is the trick. So here we're going to use a little less epoxy at a time. Okay. And we can tolerate a little bit of epoxy getting on there. I'm going to give it a wipe here once we get around. Alright, and you can even use the stick part of the applicator if that gives you a little more control. Okay, so now I'm going to take a tissue here, moisten that with some alcohol, and now I'm going to go around the engine mount tube here and get rid of anything that fell on it. Now since it's this high, it's not a big deal. The fins are going to come lower in. Alright, but I do want to keep it as clean as possible. Now here I've got that blob that was on the aft ring. I'm just going to make sure that's not going to end up in a fin slot. Okay, so we want it right there. I'll do a quick check with a fin here. sure we don't have any obstruction on any of those fin slots. All right. Okay, here I'm going to again remove any epoxy that might have got on here. Alright, and now we're going to let that cure for at least 15 minutes. If you're using a longer cure time epoxy, then an appropriately longer cure. While the motor mount epoxy is curing inside the body tube, I'm going to turn my attention to my fins. Now these already have a nice smooth finish on the faces, and so I'm not going to do much about them. May need to clean it a little bit. But for the fin tabs here, first of all, I'm going to roughen those up just slightly. Using some rougher sandpaper in there. Here's some 100 grit. Okay, and so I'm just going to roughen the area that will have epoxy on it. Now it's actually only going to be on the edges and then right above here, so just a little bit. Let me get this better under the camera. Just a little bit where the fillets are going to be. Okay. So I don't want that to go up too high, or we just got a rough spot then. Okay, so that's just dry sanding. Now for the edges themselves, you can work these like you would wood fins. So if you want, you can round the forward and taper the back and do what you want with the tip edge here. I am going to wet sand these, and I'm not going to worry about imparting too much of a roundedness. I may try and round these a little bit, but I'm going to leave the trailing edge and the tip edge square. I will sand them a little bit just to make sure we don't have any fibers sticking out. So I'm going to wet sand these with some 220 grit sandpaper off camera and then come back. And I'll do the same treatments with the other two fins as well. I have all of my fins sanded, and I was able to impart just a rounded edge on both the leading and trailing edges, and then I just sanded the tip edge flat. I did give it just a little bit of a sand on the corner edges there just so they weren't sharp. So these are all done and ready to go on. Also, I put the shock cord back up where it belongs, and then I just kind of rolled it together here and stuffed a few tissues in there just to keep it out of the way. So we are about ready to put the fins on. Oh, one other thing I did off camera was I'm going to put standard launch rail buttons on here, and my placement for the holes is such that they go through the centering rings, and I did that intentionally for additional strength. Now I started these each with a 1/16 inch pilot hole and worked my way up just until the screws that came with my buttons will just fit in there. Now these are really small centering rings, and so it is possible that when you drill it'll go through, and actually mine did. As long as the screw does not stick through through the hole, you're fine. Okay, the hole being in there is not going to hurt anything. Now if the screw is a little bit too long, if it's just slightly too long, just take some coarse sandpaper or a file and file it down. If it's much too long, get a different screw. Now if you're going to use the mini rail buttons that come with the kit, you're going to have smaller holes than I do here. So mine ended up being 9/64 by the time I got done with them. Actually, correct that, 5/32, just a little bit bigger. And that was just big enough to accept the screw. Now I won't put these on until I've got it painted, and when I do, I'll apply the epoxy to the screw itself and stick that in so that I don't push epoxy down inside the motor mount. Okay, now if that happens, I can still go in there with an applicator and some alcohol and wipe that away. But that's something you want to be aware of. Okay, I am ready now to put the fins on. I'm going to make up some epoxy and I'll be right back. I just made a major mistake that I've deleted from the video because it's bad enough just having to admit it rather than having it on video here. I put the fins on in the wrong direction. So these fins are supposed to be raked forward, all right, and not backwards like typical rocket fins are, so they should go on like this. So I got them all epoxied into place. Fortunately, I had not done the fillets yet, so I was able to break them loose, clean them up, and then I made sure to number them so that each one now is a little bit customized in order to account for the residual epoxy down inside. So now I'm making up new epoxy. Now I'm using 5-minute epoxy here. If you're less comfortable with it, you can use 15 or 30. The problem is they do take a lot longer to set up, and usually you want to get this done fairly quickly, at least initially. Okay, so here I'm going to put along the root edge, including the fin tabs, but also the edge that sticks out here, just a thin bead of epoxy. I'm going to pop that into place there. Now if you're using a fin alignment guide, you can try doing all three at once. Again, that's if you're not familiar with doing this, or this is your first fiberglass model, I would suggest just doing one at a time, letting it set. So make sure that is straight and not canted one way or the other, and then go ahead and let that cure for about 15 minutes and go on to the other two using the same technique there. Now if you're really comfortable with this, you can slide your fin alignment guide on there, do all three at once, put a rubber band around it. But that's up to you. While the epoxy on the fins is still curing, I'm going to turn our attention here to the recovery system. Now as I mentioned earlier, a parachute does not come with this kit, nor does any mounting hardware. They just supply the shock cord. And so I simmed this in OpenRocket and found that an 18-inch parachute gives us a ground hit velocity of about 20 kilometers per hour. Okay, which is fine, especially for a fiberglass rocket. If you want a little bit slower descent, a 24-inch parachute sims out to about 15 kilometers per hour on the ground hit. And this is with pretty much a wide variety of motors. It doesn't change a whole lot. So I'm going to set this up with an 18-inch parachute. This is ripstop nylon. I believe I got it from Estes, but I don't recall that for sure. And it has some fairly heavy nylon, there we go, shroud lines here. And so those of you who've seen my other videos know I'm really fond of snap swivels on parachutes, but for one with this thick of lines I can't use that. Okay, because we simply can't get that much stuff into a snap swivel. So the alternative, without permanently mounting it, is to use a quick link. And the smallest quick links I have found are these 1/8-inch ones, and then use a barrel swivel for it. Okay, now I'm going to show you another problem here. This is the smallest barrel swivel I have, and a bigger one really isn't needed, but it won't fit on my quick link. It just can't quite go over that little protrusion there. So what I'm going to do is mount this to the parachute and then run a small amount of Kevlar in a loop to mount it to here. Now another thing I'm going to do is I've got a little piece of heat shrink tubing, and you can get this in just about any place that sells electrical supplies. So this one, this batch I had got from Harbor Freight. All right, and you need one that's just big enough that you can get those shroud lines in it. Now this one's kind of on the edge there. So in this case, I need a little bit wider piece of heat shrink tubing. There we go. Okay, I'm going to recover all three of those loops there and take my parachute and just pull everything tight and then adjust things as necessary back and forth to get all of those corners at approximately the same location. Now if they're not perfectly aligned, it's not a big deal. It just means the robot that makes these things was a little out of kilter. Okay, now I'm going to pass my shroud lines through my barrel swivel. Now you can use larger ones. The weight limit on these things far exceed the rocket, so it really doesn't matter what size you use. Now I'm going to pass that quick link all through the loops, or not the quick link, but the barrel swivel all through the loops there, and pull that tight. All right, if they kind of crouch up on there, that's okay, as long as that can turn freely. And now I'm going to move my heat shrink tubing up. All right, and to shrink it, I just use a butane lighter here, set to low. Here you just want to be careful that you don't melt the shroud lines or your hand. And bring the flame right alongside it, and there we go. Right, it'll start shrinking down, and this holds your lines in place, gives it kind of a more professional look to it as well. And if you do need to disassemble this, you can simply slice off the heat shrink tubing with a hobby knife. Okay. Now, something else I am going to do here, if we look at the nose cone, and it's in the process of being painted, if I peel down my masking tape here, we've got this little tiny eyelet to connect the shock cord to the nose cone. Okay, and even if that fits, which I don't think it will, that's going to put an awful lot of strain on that little bitty piece of plastic there. So another thing I've done here is just made myself a loop in some Kevlar line. This is the same strength Kevlar that came with the kit. And this thing's about 20 inches long or so. And what I'm going to do is, once the nose is painted and everything, I'm just going to epoxy this in. I'll just put a blob of epoxy on there and lay it up against the inside of the nose cone. And that will give me this loop on the other end. Now that's just tied into place. To lock it there, I'm going to use a little bit of super glue, and we're just going to put that right on the knot there and let it soak in. Okay, and that'll keep that from unraveling, so that when we're all finished here, we'll have the nose cone tied up to the other end there, and then this will hook on. The main shock cord will hook on here as well, and then I'm also going to make a loop here. You can use Kevlar or something else. I've got a loop of nylon line already here, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. I say if you got Kevlar and you want to use that, that's fine too. This was just handy since I already had it from another project. Okay, so I'm just going to pass that through and then pass the loop over itself. Okay, and then this little piece can hook on to my quick link too. Now the disadvantage to this is the quick link does add a little bit more weight, but since this thing can fly on up to an F engine, not too worried about it. The epoxy on my fins has cured, and this is what I ended up using to keep everything in place. So this is a cardboard fin guide that's produced by Apogee. The problem is it uses 1/8 inch slots here, and we've got much thinner fins. So I've also put a rubber band on here, one to help hold them against the body tube, but also to help hold them in place so they have the same relative position within each slot, or as close as I could get it. So we'll go ahead and take this off. Oh boy. We did have a problem here as it was curing. Okay, so that one came loose. Basically it popped out as the pressure was over here. I'm going to have to break that one out and try it again. Okay, not my favorite thing to do, but sometimes it happens. So I'm going to fix this off camera, and then when I come back, we'll start in on the fillets. The fins are all now where they're supposed to be and glued in place. I'm going to prep this for fillets. Now, when using epoxy fillets, you do it in kind of the same way that you would with wood glue fillets, except that you're going to be wearing gloves, and it's a good idea to moisten your fingers with some alcohol to get a better flow of the epoxy as it goes through. Now, you can freehand this and just do it like you would a model rocket, so you put the epoxy on and then smooth it in. I like to use a little bit of masking tape here for a more uniform type of fillet. And so what I will do here is for each fin, I'm going to mask off approximately 5 millimeters or so here, or roughly 1/4 of an inch on each side. Okay, now for the leading and trailing edges of the fins, you can leave a little bit of a gap there, or you could just cut off the fillet right there if you wanted to. Same with the forward edge, although with the forward swept fins there, it's a little more difficult. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just put one piece around these. You can also do these in single smaller pieces for each fin. And that kind of depends on how quickly you can do the fillets. So if this is a new process to you, I would just go ahead and make a masking tape here and another one there, etc. as we go around. Okay, so this one will be a little bit more complicated to do. Kind of duck under here. Okay, so those are all masked off, and we'll just kind of squish everything down. Now for this, you've got a couple of choices. If all you have is 5-minute epoxy, or if you're new to this, what I would suggest is doing one fin at a time. So you're going to take your 5-minute epoxy and smooth that in, wait for about 3 minutes, and then remove the masking tape from that area only. Now what I'm going to do is use 15-minute epoxy. I'm going to do all of them at once, and then I'm going to come back and rotate this every few minutes as that epoxy hardens, and then once it gets to about 10 minutes I'll remove all of the masking tape. Okay, and so you'll see what's going on as I do this. Alright, 30-minute epoxy is going to give you a lot of trouble, because unless you want to be in here turning this all the time so it doesn't sag or run to one side or the other, you're going to be really, really busy. Okay, so 5-minute, one fin at a time, 15 minutes to do all three at a time. I'm just finishing mixing up my 15-minute epoxy. I've got about 6 grams here. If you're doing one fin at a time with the 5-minute epoxy, I recommend about 2 grams at a time. That should be more than enough for each fin. Okay, now we also want to have some rubbing alcohol on hand, and this is what you'll use to help smooth in the epoxy. So here I'm going to do around 1 fin at a time. I'm just going to smooth that in initially with this craft stick. It's a popsicle stick. Alright. That's what they sell them as, unless you eat a lot of popsicles. Alright, now you notice I got a little bit off the fins there, and this is one of the reasons we want to have the alcohol standing by, is uncured epoxy can be removed with rubbing alcohol. Okay, now over here at my leading edge, I'm just going to tuck a little bit in there. Alright, make sure we've got it around the trailing edge. That looks alright. Alright, now you can do this if you're doing the 5-minute epoxy 1 fin at a time, then you're going to do it like this. If you're doing what I'm doing with the 15-minute epoxy, you can do this after you've done all fins. Alright, here I'm just going to moisten my fingertip. I've got a tight fitting glove on. Alright, and I'm just going to very gently smooth in the epoxy here. You can wipe the excess off. Okay, like I've got a little bit there on the top of the fin. Maybe I don't want that there, so I can take my alcohol again. Just going to smooth that down. Okay. And if you need to, you can even, again, wipe off excess there. Using the alcohol and a tissue. Okay. Now, again, if you're using the 5-minute epoxy, wait for about 3 minutes and then remove the masking tape. Alright, I'm going to keep going with my 15-minute epoxy here. This is actually setting up a bit faster than I would expect for a 15-minute epoxy here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the tape. And be careful, you've got epoxy probably on your fingers all over by now, and be careful where you're putting them. You may have to clean some more epoxy off the body tube then. Now with the tape off, I'm just doing a little bit of last minute touch-ups here. At this point I'm going to leave the fins alone, but there are some areas like right there where a little bit of epoxy got in between the tapes. There's a little bit trying to creep up right there, and I don't want to bother with it too much. I might just make things worse. Okay, a little bit there. Alright, so now I'm going to let this cure, and for the first 10 minutes or so I'm just going to turn it 1/3 around about every 2 minutes. But one of the things this is going to allow it to do is the remaining fluidity of the epoxy should taper down all of the tape joints there. So I'll come back when this is all done. My fin fillets have cured enough that I don't need to worry about them running down the rocket or down the fins or anything. Now originally I was going to wait on the rail buttons until after I painted on it, but the more I think about it, I'm thinking that I don't want paint getting down in there where it could interfere with adhesion. So I'm going to go ahead and put these on now, and then I'll mask them off. I'm using some 5-minute epoxy, and I've used just enough here to make a little puddle there, so about a drop of each of the resin and hardener. Okay, this is the screw that came with this rail button, and so it only protrudes about that far down. And I've already tested these and made sure that they don't poke down into the motor tube there. And just to make sure that I don't get epoxy down in the motor tube, I'm going to epoxy the screw rather than the hole. Okay, so this first one should just pop right in like that. I will get a screwdriver here just to make sure it's all the way down. Okay, so I'll just give that a little turn. It's not really threaded. The upper one actually did get a little bit of thread to it, and so I'll screw it in. Same way here, I'm doing a little bit of epoxy on the threads of the screw so that excess is going to be forced up into the rail button innards rather than down inside the tube. Okay, quick check here. They're pretty much in line. That looks good to me. Alright, I am going to let this continue curing overnight before I try and paint it. I want to explain something about the rail buttons here, as I'm sure someone's going to make a comment about it, is why do I have them both so far down here? Now in bigger rockets where I can get my hand down inside, I will usually put an upper rail button proportionally around here. So if I've got basically a 3-inch rocket or a larger diameter, I can get my hand down in there. Then I can use a T-nut as a backer to hold the rail button in place further up. Since I can't get a hand down in there, then my other option is to simply put in a screw that's going to dangle down inside of there and could potentially get tangled up in the recovery system. Now, when I've got this type of thing, usually what I'll do is try and put the forward rail button within the region of the motor mount tube. Now, since this motor mount tube doesn't extend that far much, or that much further, there we go, get my words out, than where I've got it now, I'm not too worried about it. But that way, if I do have to have a blind entry there where I can't do anything for the back of the screw, at least it's not going to get tangled up with the shock cord and such. So that's why this is so far back. On my, most of my rockets where I'm using rail buttons, I will put the aft rail button as far back as I can get it, so it maintains contact with the rail for as long as possible while the rocket is gaining velocity. The epoxy on the fillets has cured, as has the epoxy on the rail buttons. And if you notice here along the fins where I made the fillets, it's a little bit irregular. And you can prevent that by masking the fins at the same time you mask the body tube. Frankly, I just forgot to do it. Getting old really sucks. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do then is mask off the rail buttons there, and this is going to go into the hood for painting and priming, not in that order. Now, most of the body is going to be painted in this same metallic blue that I have for the nose cone, and then one of the fins will be white and another fin will be red, and then the third fin will have the same blue as the rest of the rocket. So this is going to take some painting time and drying time and masking time and all that good stuff, but I'm not going to put you through that. When I come back, we'll take a look at it after it's been primed and then after it's been finished.